Pat, I was just saying before we during the break that you couldn't have chosen a better time to launch a book about, how exactly parties bargain for better wages, given the kind of current strikes that we've had both in the mining sector and now we've seen also in the agricultural sector. Talk to us about what the big reasons are for bringing out a book like this and how businesses can find it useful.
Thank you. Well, first of all, as you rightly say, I didn't write this post-Marikana. Marikana happened. Obviously, there are a number of issues raised that I have in the book that are disturbing as a result of that. But the purpose of the book was to actually focus on this collective bargaining process in South Africa, which over a number of years there has been a general concern as perhaps not met the needs of the South African economy or the population in general. So that was the purpose behind the writing of the book.
Now, of course, the whole question of bargaining in search of a better wage regime has come under a lot of pressure in recent months. We've seen some commentators arguing that the social compact in South Africa is simply not holding. You guys have both been involved in industrial relations for a number of years. From your perspective, from a legal perspective, how useful is this book for someone who is in fact a negotiator, within the bargaining council?
Well, Pat makes the point that the current structures of collective bargaining simply don't work. It's adversarial and simply do not produce the results that we want. He then makes the other point and says, well, if you look at South Africa, we've got the ability, the fibre to deal with all sorts of social conflict and political conflict, but this inherent conflict between capital and labour, for whatever reason, we can't deal with. And he then draws certain conclusions upon why the scenario is like that. The reality is, if you look at the World Global Competitive Index, out of 139 countries surveyed, we're really right down at the bottom. And one of the main reasons are that in the area of employment relations is the failure of collective bargaining. The IMF in the latest report specifically indicates that collective bargaining in South Africa does not work. So for practitioners participating in the game and playing the game, it's fundamentally important to learn the rules of the game and establish those games. And Pat makes the point and says a different approach should be followed. And unless we follow the different approach, he calls it a multidisciplinary approach, we're simply not going to get there.
Pat, let me bring you in here. We have been told that our collective bargaining system doesn't work. Is it a design fault? Is it because the participants to the process simply are not able to exercise the roles that they're playing? Is there a lack of trust? What is it?
I think as a general comment, we may not be good at playing the bargaining game, but we seem to be very good in South Africa at playing the blame game. And as a result of that, when things go wrong, there's always a tendency to change the law, change the framework. What we really need is leadership on both sides of the table. We need a development of skills on both sides of the table, and we need a realization that the parties need one another in an economic environment and to move away from the politics.
I want to pick up on this question of needing each other. When I spoke to a political economist recently, what the person was saying was that Labour and business are so distrustful of each other that they see each other as enemies rather than opponents. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the wage work bargain, it clearly is an economic relationship. Both parties need one another for the process to work. We seem to approach the matter through just total self-interest without saying, look, there is a shared need here and a shared dependency, and therefore we find that we do not have the creative process that this country desperately needs.
Let me bring you in here, Dr. van Zyl. The whole point about getting to a solution. What about the bargaining game? What about this book will help whoever is in that bargaining chamber get to a consensus? Because that seems to be, the major stumbling block. I've interviewed unions across the sectors, employers, and it's very difficult to get to consensus because everyone comes in and paints themselves in such a corner that they can't move forward.
Pat makes a couple of valid points in the book, and in this regard. And the first one is he says that when you negotiate and you represent the employer, it's fundamental that you create the scenario of trust when the employer says, this is the only bottom line that I can afford, I can't go beyond that. The other side understands it, appreciates it, and believes it. And Pat then makes the other point and says that when Labour says, well, this is really our bottom line, the converse is equally true. Where collective bargaining goes wrong is when you masquerade, and the bottom line is not the bottom line, and everything is up for negotiations. If you have a collective agreement, let's take Marikana, and Pat could probably comment a little bit about that. If you take Marikana, one of the fundamental mistakes that happened in Marikana was there was a collective agreement in place that regulated these issues, and that should be upheld.
But one of the parties opted out of that arrangement.
Well, look, the rules are very clear, and they're there for a purpose. You have a collective agreement, you buy into that agreement, and it's binding on the parties. If you break that agreement, where is the trust relationship the next time round for any